but this is the second of these events because we did a little bit of rebranding. So it was previously referred to as the Interdisciplinary Lecture Series, but we decided that that was too long of a title for Peter to keep typing into the emails, and so we shortened it to the Scholars Forum. It sounds very scholarly, right? So there's high expectation. The bar is set high when you use that word scholar, right? And so I'm here today to introduce to you, and many of you already know him, Jeremy Norton. He's a professor of political science at Lake-Sumter State College, where he's served students since 2005. A Central Florida native, he attended the University of Florida, where I went as well. Earning a bachelor's and master's degrees in political science and international relations before continuing his education at the University of South Florida, where he earned a Master of Library Science. He began his career here at Lake-Sumter as a librarian before transitioning full-time to the social sciences faculty. In 2017, he delivered a TED Talk, I remember that, TED XLSSC, on the topic of community democracy. In 2020, he was named Professor of the Year by the Association of Florida Colleges. And in 2025, he received the Faculty Award as part of the Lake-Sumter State College Hall of Fame. He enjoys going on adventures, learning random new things, and eating delicious foods. He lives in Tavares with his wife, Allison, a fellow faculty member at the college. Their 2 children, both Lake-Sumter graduates, and 2 cats who have not yet attended Lake-Sumter College. So without further ado, Mr. Jeremy Norton.
All right, great to see everybody. Yeah, hey, yeah, for you, yeah, absolutely. This is gonna be a fun time. And so thank you for the introduction. And today I get to talk to you a bit about the Declaration of Independence and the birth of an American political culture. So it kind of feels like a mouthful. But basically, we're going to go through what was happening 250 years ago, because as many of you know, there it is. We are celebrating the 250th anniversary of the Declaration of Independence, of American independence. And so as part of that, we're going to take a deeper look at our founding document, the Declaration of Independence, its influences, what it did, what it didn't do, and its role in our political culture. So especially things like the established ideals that we have as Americans, the concept of unity, the fact that we like to criticize leadership. That's a biggie, right? As well as, the way things are, going against the status quo, which makes us sort of exceptional as a nation. You maybe heard of that, American exceptionalism. And many movements from the bottom up have borrowed from the Declaration of Independence. And so we want to sort of reflect on sort of where we are 250 years later, but first we've got to go back into the past, right? Back into what it was like 250 years ago and even further, right? Because there wasn't always a United States. First, we had these colonies, right? And so this is a map here of the colonies that were eventually all British colonies, but they didn't all start that way. The colonies began for a lot of different reasons. Virginia was a company. The Pilgrims came and settled Massachusetts. Georgia was a prison colony. I like to remind them of that as a Gator that I am. So you had different populations, different religions. Maryland was Catholic. And so, there was no unity. So when we think about the United States, well, they weren't states and they weren't united. New York was Dutch. We had populations of Native Americans and African slaves and freedmen and Germans and Swedes and Spanish and French, right? And so at no point did people look at the map and say, yeah, that's like a unified sort of culture. So basically we had no unity, we had no culture. Now, the thing that kind of creates a culture is sometimes necessary, a need. And there was an early incorporation of that. So while they were all British subjects by the time we kind of come into this phase, they weren't united. And so maybe you've seen this before: the snake, right? Join or die. Now, this is not actually a Revolutionary War thing. This goes back even further. This is coming from 20 years earlier during what we call here the French and Indian War. This particular political cartoon was in the Pennsylvania Gazette, which was a publication by Benjamin Franklin. And so Benjamin Franklin was one of the few people back in the 1750s that was starting to think of like an American culture or some sort of united America. And the reason being that we had to join or die, all these different colonies, was the common threat of the French. Right? So the French were attacking. There was a big worldwide war between the British and the French. But the fact is, there wasn't a lot of sort of moves for, oh, we want this united kind of even colonies. And indeed, the war ended, and we ended up, as British subjects, sort of on the hook financially, right? And so one of the first things to kind of spur the American political culture was taxation, right? Taxation without what? Yeah, because you're part of the American political culture. It's already happening, yes. So yes, taxation without representation. And indeed, the war debts that the British had meant that they needed to raise money. And the fact is, it was Parliament who raised money. And Parliament had representatives, but there were no representatives from the American colonies. And so this was seen as a problem, right? So we had these groups like the Sons of Liberty who would say, oh, taxation without representation. You can't do these sorts of things. You can't raise money on us. And they were mad about things like the Stamp Act, right? So any sort of business transaction was taxed. And Benjamin Franklin, who was in the scene there as a publisher in Philadelphia, he was also a scientist, and he decided to retire and sort of lobby on behalf of the state of Pennsylvania. And he went to London, and the Continental Congress, which met here in Philadelphia as well, got together with that common sort of gripe. We don't want to pay taxes without the representation. So they lobbied against this. So other colonies also, reached out to Ben Franklin, places like Georgia, New Jersey, Massachusetts, but realized that these are all different places, speaking highly different accents, doing different things. However, one colony, Massachusetts, created a bit more trouble for the British than some of the others, to put it lightly, right? And they sort of chafed under the taxes, and indeed, Parliament eventually got rid of the Stamp Act, but unfortunately, they replaced it with some other things because they still had to raise money because they were in debt. They were unhappy, they didn't want to pay the taxes, and so when you have an unruly group, you send in authorities to keep order. What authorities did the British send in? Troops, right? The Redcoats, which did not go over well, right? Standing army in your town, you're not very happy about it. You feel like, hey, we're not an enemy. And they got angry at them, and they threw things at them. And then what happened? The Boston Massacre, right? So you guys know all this. This is good. Now, this led to sort of the British pushing back, and the colonists sort of pushing back, and they wanted to hold the trial. And so these things were unruly. So they put additional taxes, right? Because they had to pay for these resources. So one of the big ones was tea. Yeah. Once again, Massachusetts. What happened? Yeah, so the Sons of Liberty and the merchants went on the ships and they threw the king's tea into the harbor, which does not go over well in Britain because it's technically the king's tea. It's symbolic. It's also very expensive. And so Parliament passes these things called the Intolerable Acts, also called the Coercive Acts, which not only, put them on the hook for the tea that they lost by closing the harbor, which was a real problem, but also, to take away some of their local control. They took away their colonial governance. They made them quarter soldiers, like all these things that made them even more angry. To the point that the British kind of got the hint that they're so angry that, we should probably go after their leaders because I think they're arming themselves. They have these militias, these Minutemen. We don't know what's going to happen. And so they marched the soldiers, right? 2F by C. Yeah, you know the story. And eventually, the American colonists, the Massachusetts militia, fired at the Redcoats, right? And that led to, what do we call that? shouted around the world, right? We now have the American Revolution. But here's the thing. We don't quite know what this is about other than there's firing. So Franklin, while he's lobbying, isn't exactly going to get a lot of push because the king is saying that Massachusetts is in a state of rebellion. And that's a big, big charge, right? And so they're sending more troops, and the rest of the Congress, right, they'd gotten together about these taxes. They now have to deal with these larger issues, and they made a choice. They chose to be united, to not just let Massachusetts kind of be taken away. So at the Continental Congress, the Second Continental Congress, one of the things they did was they created a Continental Army, and they got a Virginian, George Washington, to then take that over. And sent him up to Massachusetts to help with the siege of Boston. So that gets us into 1776. So that's January. He's up there. And we start to have this idea of a united. We don't have a full culture, but we got some united. And even we have some symbols. So here is the flag that was put up in January of 1776. So General Washington at the time referred to it as, we are the United American Colonies. So we're not the United States yet. We're not there yet. And there was some success in Boston. They were able to get the British Army to evacuate because they put some cannons on some high hills, which is seen as a big success. That was happening about this time in the spring of 1776. And then they were heading over to New York to protect that. And the war was sort of ongoing. And that gets us to where we start to talk about, well, what is this really about? Are we just mad about taxes? Are we mad about self-government? Are we just reacting? What is this? And a lot of different scholars were discussing it. A lot of different people were discussing it. And actually a new transplant from England, he'd only been there maybe a year, by the name of Thomas Paine, wrote a pamphlet, and it was published at the beginning of 1776, and it's called Common Sense, which is an excellent title, right? Yeah, Common Sense, what's common sense? And instead of going and discussing these things in sort of highfalutin academic ways that maybe, later like Thomas Jefferson or Benjamin Franklin, he wrote kind of to the lowest common denominator. He's like, here's what this is really about, and here's what you should know. And so Common Sense was incredibly successful. It's to my knowledge, is the top American title published ever. Like the amount of distribution, and it happened really quick. So it went viral, right, when it comes down to it. And it democratized this political debate. It used plain, blunt language, biblical references, and made sort of a large argument about why this isn't about reconciling, why it's not about, just taxing, and why indeed it's about independence. And this is a new thing. Now, some voices were there, but he was able to kind of give this spark to this independence movement. Not only that, he attacked the monarchy. This is a big deal, right? It's a big deal to shoot at the monarchy. It's also a big deal to sort of trash them in the press, which is what this is happening. He called King George III a royal brute and said that hereditary monarchy itself was absurd and unjust, right? So what is that called? Anybody know what that's called? It's called sedition, right? So it's seditious libel specifically, which he was eventually charged for. And they tried him in absentia. Now, the thing about this particular pamphlet is it was so popular that even Washington had it read to his troops there in Boston, right? And so from January 1776 to where we start getting towards the summer, this became the sort of rallying cry for a lot of Americans, which is another piece of that political culture, bottom up, right? You get the people involved. Now, it was the people who were fighting as the people they had to convince. And so this pamphlet was very short, so it was easily read aloud at taverns, town squares, right, churches, wherever they wanted to discuss this sort of thing. And it sort of laid the groundwork for the Revolution, for Declaration of Independence. And so one of the controversial concepts that he pushed was that we shouldn't have a monarchy, we should have a republic. That's a big deal. On top of that there was this concept of equality. Equality. So I'll read it because I think it's important. Primary source. Always have your primary source. I'm a librarian after all. So mankind being originally equals in the order of creation, the equality could only be destroyed by some subsequent circumstance, which he blamed the monarchy for doing. So yes, that all men are created equal, that really caught with Thomas Paine. He wasn't the only influence in this particular instance. Like I said, the Patriots in Massachusetts, right? George Washington, the Congress meeting in Philadelphia. And eventually, they met again in Philadelphia, and they started figuring out, well, what actually do we want to do here, right? Because at this time, there was some success in Boston. They were about to fail in New York, and they just realized that, if they're going to do this thing, they've created a continental army. We needed to actually define this, and we need to incorporate all these different ideas together. And so one of the representatives from Virginia by the name of Richard Henry Lee put out a proposal and put a motion on the floor essentially to declare independence for each of the 13 states. And so what that would mean is all of our states are now countries. All of our colonies are now countries. And on top of that, he wanted a confederation and to form alliances. And so that was accepted. And then the Congress decided, well, now we need somebody to write up this particular Declaration of Independence to address to, the world, to the king, to the army, whomever. And so this committee was created. So this is a famous John Trumbull painting. And it didn't maybe look exactly like this. All the people weren't there at the same time. Although he did paint to life. He did meet most of these people and painted them. But you can see the committee of 5 there. They were tasked with actually writing this. So it included Thomas Jefferson, Benjamin Franklin, John Adams, and the other 2 you don't hear too much about, but I'll give them props. Roger Sherman of Connecticut and Robert Livingston of New York. So they were tasked with writing this. And they were given, parameters by Congress. Hey, this is what we want to do, and now let's figure it out. So Thomas Jefferson was the principal author. He's a very eloquent writer, but he was not the only person who had done it. Ben Franklin was a very good editor. He was 70 years old at this time, but because he had done newspapers, things like that, he was directly involved. John Adams was sort of a revolutionary, right? He was pushing. He was from Massachusetts. And Sherman and Livingston were lawyers as well. Now, the other influence that we had was some of the things that, these kind of bookish type people were into, right? Things that love like political philosophy, right? Writings of political philosophy like this one. This is 2 Treatises of Government by John Locke. Now, John Locke was an English political philosopher. He published this back in the late 1600s, so it was like almost 100 years old at this time. And it had, some discussion about what the role of government is. And he talks about some pretty big concepts, one of which is the social contract. And the social contract, according to Locke, meant this agreement that the people being ruled and those ruling have with each other. And it's a deal that's being made, right? A contract. So that contract, according to Locke, was that we give our power, we allow governments to rule over us because their role is to protect our rights of life, liberty, and property, right? And so this was sort of a big deal. And it's like, okay, well, this is why governments exist. Maybe not to keep order. That was another thought of the social contract. But the Locke version was that. And he went on to say that if, for some reason, there's a breakdown and one of the 2 parties isn't holding their deal, like if the governing party isn't holding their end of the deal, you have the right to abolish it. You have the right to revolt. Now, technically, what he was writing about was this thing in England called the Glorious Revolution, which was the changing of management from one royal to another. However, this was seen as like a pretty big deal, especially to this guy, Thomas Jefferson, right? As I mentioned, the eloquent sort of principal author. He thought John Locke was the greatest political philosopher of all time. And you can start to see the echoes of some of the things that I just mentioned that end up in the Declaration. So it's another major influence. Now, also realize that it wasn't like they sat down and wrote this thing out and it was perfect. You guys ever done that? Wrote a paper and you're like, wow, that's perfect. No? Probably not. So that's what it looked like, right? So this is actually the working copy of the Declaration of Independence. And so this is Jefferson's copy, so he's writing, and then you can see where Benjamin Franklin crossed some things out and John Adams added some stuff, right? There's all kinds of back and forth. And so that committee of 5 became that committee of 3, with just those 3. And then they had to sort of present these ideas to Congress. Now, a few things about the Declaration of Independence and what they were trying to do. So at this point, we don't know when it's going to happen. This is June of 1776 when they're writing this. A few things that it did and didn't do. You're probably used to seeing the nice calligraphied copy. See, it didn't start that way, just remember. Now, even after that edit, the Congress Congress took out whole sections of what the committee had done as well. So, just like we have the committees here on the college, that things change, yeah, it happens, right? That's how committee structures work. Now, what did this document do? What did it not do? Well, it gave us a birthday. There it is, July 4th, 1776. We celebrate our independence, our 250-year anniversary, because of that date. We have fireworks, all this good stuff. Ironically, some of the founders thought it should have been like July 2nd, or it should have been, when Richard Henry Lee did the motion, but the date's on the top. We'll stick with that. It works. Now, it did not start the revolution. It did not end the revolution. It took many more years. It did not create a government. So what did it do? Well, it talked about what governments are supposed to do and explained why Great Britain hadn't held up their end of the deal and gave all the reasons why. And that is what kind of gets us into that political culture thing. And so the details are kind of lost on us now, like in the 21st century, but there's quite a bit there. Now, the fact is, this document was written by, academic types. I mean, Thomas Jefferson went to found the University of Virginia, so they're academics. But it was also kind of written with that combination of what Thomas Paine had done in the Common Sense. In fact, a lot of stuff from Common Sense ends up in the Declaration of Independence. Things from Locke end up in the Declaration of Independence. And also things from documents they were working on right around that time, including George Mason's Virginia Declaration. A lot of the same Locke ideas that he sort of put into the local document. Things like all men are by nature equally free and independent, have certain inherent natural rights, the enjoyment of life and liberty with the means of acquiring and possessing property. That's not Locke, that's not Jefferson, that's George Mason. So yay, George Mason, right? So it was interesting to see the stew of things coming together into this one document. And so what does it actually say? I have it right here, right? It's not very long. That's important, right? Because they wanted to get this message across. It was a rallying cry for what the revolution was about. So when in the course of human events, it becomes necessary for one people to dissolve the political bands which have connected them with another, and to assume among the powers of the earth separate and equal station to which the laws of nature and nature's God entitle them. Yes, so a decent respect of the opinions of mankind requires that they should declare the causes which shall impel them to separation. So we are declaring independence. It's right up there. The unanimous declaration of the 13 United States of America. All right. We hold these truths to be self-evident. That all men are created equal. See, we know this stuff. That's good. And are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights. So among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, and that to secure these rights, governments are instituted among men, deriving their powers from the consent of the governed, and that when any form of government becomes destructive to these ends, it is the right of the people to alter or to abolish it. Big deal. It's, hey, we say this is what government works, this is how Locke described it, this is how the English even understand it. Guess what? You messed up. We have the right to revolt. Who is this addressed to? The king, parliament, the world. Yeah. And they go into some details. They complain. American political culture. They go after the leadership, right? The king, just like Thomas Paine did. So here we go. The history of the present king of Great Britain is a history of repeated injuries and usurpations, all having in direct object the establishment of absolute tyranny over these states. To prove this, let the facts be submitted to a candid world. And it goes through very clearly. He has refused to assent to laws. He has forbidden his governors to pass laws of immediate and present importance. He has refused to pass other laws of accommodating large districts of people. He has dissolved representative houses. He has endeavored to prevent populations of these states from the laws of naturalization of foreigners. So there's a whole list. There's 27 different grievances, sort of pinpointing the king. Now, here's the thing about the British system. Who makes law in the British system? Parliament. Now, Parliament's mentioned. They're there. But you get a bit more oomph blaming the one, right? This is a very populist sort of message. Jefferson and Franklin totally understood how this system worked, but by going after the king, it's rallying everybody else. It's saying the same things. Some pretty big things, right? So imposing taxes without our consent. That's a big one, right? For transporting us beyond our seas to be tried for pretended offenses, right? There's a lot of these things. And they're listing it all out. They blame not only the king, they also blame the English people for letting it happen, right? Because ultimately, they're shooting at English soldiers, right? And they're addressing this to England. They're addressing it to the world. And then they end it sort of, I guess, with a flourish, right? So that, we should be able to do everything that independent states can do. And for the support of this declaration, with a firm reliance on the protection of our divine providence, we mutually pledge to each other our lives, our fortunes, and our sacred honor. And then they signed it. What is that called? High treason. Yes. And the thing about common sense, Paine's name is not on common sense. We know he wrote it. It came out sort of later, but he was smart enough not to put his name on it because then they'll come and hunt you down. But realize that, Hancock signed it first, right? And so then later the other people did. But the fact is, these are like the wealthiest people in America. I mean, the one exception is Washington, but he was, also doing a thing. He just wasn't there. So Hancock and Robert Morris, and these are some heavy hitters. And they put their name on it. I mean, that is high treason. So what's the penalty for treason? Yes. So you take your property, death, maybe draw and quarter, right? That's the traditional way. And so this is sort of a big deal because, hey, it's all or nothing, right? We want to stay united. So that join or die thing kind of comes back, right? We got to stay united. We got to we're in this for the long haul. Our name's on the document. And indeed, some bad things happened, right, to some of these individuals. Now, where it takes us to the American political culture is, yes, we had this. So this got read immediately as soon as the troops got it in New York. Washington had the Declaration of Independence read to all of his troops later that July, all across. So everybody kind of knew, here's why we're fighting. Right? So we have the right to fight. We're not doing anything wrong. They're the ones that are doing anything wrong. Why? Here are all the reasons. Right? So a lot of it's kind of, for lack of a better word, propaganda. Right? It's like all these things. Now, most of these things probably didn't happen to the individual soldiers or officers, but the fact is, some version had happened. Some of it was over the top. But you're making a good argument by going after the leader, right? Good news, they won. Spoiler alert. It took a lot, right? It took a lot of unity. It took all these things, but then realize that this didn't create a government. There was a structure that they created. Anybody remember what the name of that is, my students? The Articles of Confederation, right? So there's a confederation, which was essentially a treaty between the 13 countries. So states are countries. So 13 countries, and there's a treaty between them with just Congress. The Confederation Congress was the only thing. That particular structure did not last very long, about 11 and some change. And we ended up with this. What's that? The Constitution. Not the focus here. So we're here for the semi-quincentennial, right? Yeah. And the semi-quincentennial is of the Declaration. The semi-quincentennial of the Constitution will be in September 17th of 2037. So hold your breath for that one. So I'm not going to go into the structure here, other than to say, once they kind of got around to actually making a structured government that had not just a Congress, but an executive, and essentially the United States becoming a country and not a collection of countries. And some of those same motifs, that culture is right there. We the people. It's the people. It's not just these sort of aristocrats, it's the people. Yeah. In order to form a what? A more perfect union. So even some recognition that the things they put in the Declaration of Independence were ideals. Ideals you wanted to live up to. America, at that time for sure, was the only country that was founded on ideals, not on a shared religion, royal family, language even. It was all over the place, right? So what you want to do is make a more perfect union based on those ideals. And indeed, in the Constitution, there's a lot of sort of like, all the things we complained about, a few years ago, we should probably include. So there's no taxation without representation. It's right there, Article 1. We added things about, the right to petition grievances, to be mad about things and let people know you're allowed to do that. The freedom of the press. Yeah, so quite a bit there. Now, where this gets us into the political culture is you can start to see it here. And it's amazing to me that, we got this stew of things, we had this revolution, we were successful, and then how enduring those things are. So here in the Constitution, but even when we look at how these things are viewed from outside. So this particular publication, Democracy in America, was written by a Frenchman named Alexis de Tocqueville back in the 1830s. So he went around the United States and tried to figure out like what's the American character? And it's amazing. He could be describing us today, right? There's something to it. He talked about the American character, that we have an equality of conditions in the common man, and we have an inherent restlessness, right? And this idea that like there's sort of that idea of the rugged individual, right? But at the same time, there's like some unity of purpose, and it's a lot of common man stuff. And indeed, you see that motif, and you see political parties sort of follow that as well. Like they understand that these mythic ideas are all in our heads, and it's like that's what makes American. And you don't see a lot of like pushing back against that. Now, the one thing you do see is sort of because America was set up on ideals that maybe they fall short. And people throughout American history have pointed that out on numerous occasions. Let's talk about some. Yeah. So a former slave, Frederick Douglass. So he in the 1850s, he sort of joined as part of the abolitionist cause against slavery. And he directly quoted the Declaration of Independence, and he had a whole speech and publication about what to the slave is the 4th of July. To basically say he used the Declaration to highlight the measurable distance between the country's ideals and the reality of slavery. And he argued that the phrase all men was inclusive. Now, that's a political battle, but unfortunately on that one, it got worse. Right? We ended up with actual battles, right? One of the major issues that we had, or the most catastrophic event in American history, was when it ceased to be united, right? The Union did not hold. The South seceded and created another country. And there was horrendous battles in the 1860s to sort of solve this. But realize that both the North, the Union, and the South, the Confederacy, both used the Declaration of Independence as the reasons why they were right. That's how ingrained it was. It wasn't like we're getting rid of it. Like, no, we had the right to revolt. Why? Well, pursuit of happiness and liberty. Well, what does liberty mean? You can't make us do things. Well, liberty means actually the way Frederick Douglass says right? Huge political debates, very controversial, but remember, they're kind of on the same page with the Declaration, which is interesting. Now, that particular issue was, slavery was solved through the battle and, the amendments that added these ideas of equality into the Constitution. The 14th Amendment has that word in there, and that's really important. But it wasn't all. There's been other movements. right? So the suffragettes, women's rights movements, you can see some of these pictures. There's stuff there's language from the Declaration behind them, right? So this is the suffragette march here. The women's movements existed even before that, way back to the Seneca Falls Convention. So Elizabeth Cady Stanton mirrored the Declaration structure when she said, "We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men and women are created equal," and proceeded to have 18 injuries by men against women, just as Jefferson had listed these things against the king, right? The structure, the format was, what movements go for. Because they understand it, they see it as a form of justice, but then the rest of us, whether or not we're involved with that movement, we understand the context, we understand the format. So civil rights marchers here, same thing. You're seeing the same kinds of stuff on their signs, right? So Martin Luther King referred to the Declaration as the promissory note that had been returned marked insufficient funds. For Black Americans, for insufficient funds for Black Americans, rather. So the I Have a Dream speech, he explicitly called for the nation to rise up and live out the true meaning of its creed. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal. All men. Okay, I can't do it like he does. And so we see the labor movement talk about like industrial tyranny and it's getting in the way of the pursuit of happiness, right? It's amazing how often there's very few social movements you don't see that are borrowing directly from this initial protest document, this ideals document that we have. And even more recently, 21st century, so we have things from the Tea Party. Remember the Tea Party protests back in 2009, 2010, right? They literally had the Gadsden flag and hats and talked about tax and FRA, right? No more, they're angry at taxation. Purely very good American thing. We're used to this. The No Kings protests, right? We see stuff, all kinds of imagery from the Declaration of Equality. You see these movements latch onto this because it's one of those things. There's not a politician in the United States that couldn't quote the Declaration of Independence. People aren't going to stand up and be like, no, it just doesn't make sense. So you didn't realize how ingrained the political culture is just from this document, which is impressive. Because remember, ironically, didn't create a government, didn't actually say anything particularly new. It just sort of combined some things. And the complaints in the context about the king, they don't ring so true because we don't have those exact issues anymore. But that spirit is right there. The U.S. was founded on an idea, and this idea was encapsulated with the Declaration of Independence. And it's just so integrated and inescapable that we're still talking about it today. And they're my references. Thank you. So I think we're going to do, if you have questions, we can do so. I'll sit down with Woody and we'll do some questions. Yeah. They gave us these chairs, so I'm going to use it. Yeah.
They do with mine.
Yeah. Yeah.
All right. Time for questions.
So why do I think that the authors in Congress went towards the Lockean versus Hobbesian? Well, John Locke was, like I said, he had been around quite a bit longer. Thomas Jefferson, and sort of these were Enlightenment ideas. So this is the time of the Enlightenment. And so that was sort of a big deal in England. It was a big deal in the colonies. And so the Hobbesian, like kind of more, government exists for order. I always tell my students, it's like there's echoes there. It's like, they read it. I think it comes up more in the Constitution than the Declaration. But I think that it was even something that the English couldn't argue with because it's the thing that the English were talking about too, about this is the actual role of government. And then to kind of throw it in their face, like, yeah, it is. And here's how you didn't do it. Here's our grievances and why you haven't held up. And so I think it was a lot of it was Jefferson and Franklin, and Benjamin Franklin was like friends with Voltaire. It's like they were all kind of, it was sort of the movement, and I think it's a unique time that puts all of this there. I'm not sure if there's such an overwhelming kind of movement right this second that would kind of bring people together like that. But I would say, certainly Jefferson, and Paine was pretty much he was pretty much in the same vein too on sort of what we think these things should be. So that idea of the creator and natural rights and all this. So, does that work?
I feel like Hobbes had the better title, though.
Leviathan? Yeah, it is a cool title. So, this is important. She asked what the context of the wigs. If you look closely, Americans don't really wear wigs. Now, how people in Hollywood do. I mean, so when you look at the founders and stuff, they if you look at their hair, that's like Washington didn't wear a wig. That was his hair. Franklin didn't. You can see his big bald spot. Yeah. So the wig was more of a European thing. It was more of an aristocratic thing. And so, not that I said some of those people probably didn't. When we became a republic, it became less of a fashion choice because it looked a bit different. Now, they had the same fancy hair, but it was usually their actual hair. Funny story about that is the first time the Supreme Court met when it was established, the judges, if you've ever seen an English judge, they have the big, huge wigs. Well, a lot of the judges that started, I don't know which one off the top of my head, but a lot of the judges that started, had been judges already. And so one of the new Supreme Court justices showed up wearing the wig, and the other one sort of got onto it. He took it off, and that was it. They haven't worn them since. So anyway, yay America. I mean, I could wear a pretty cool wig, I suppose. Right? What else we got? Yes.
The Terranova.
Yeah. So, on some initial drafts I've seen, and certainly you see the life, liberty, and property. So, is life, liberty, and estate? That's John Locke would say it sometimes that way. That was sort of the concept, but you started to see that pursuit of happiness, which I think is a great turn of phrase, right? And actually, when I saw the edited version, I initially had thought that maybe Jefferson had put property and then it was changed. Some of the other things like self-evident were changed. But interestingly, the life, liberty, and property does appear in the Constitution a little bit later. It comes up in like the Fifth Amendment and other places. So that concept sticks around. So the idea of natural rights, it's not just life, liberty, and property. There's other natural rights. But the idea is every individual has a right to live, to be free, and to their possessions. Now, the pursuit of happiness, I think, is great because it's not a guarantee of happiness. It's that you have the right to try, right? You can pursue that, right? And so that's where it becomes aspirational and ideals, because it's like, well, what does that mean? Like I said, some movements or individuals say, hey, part of my pursuit of happiness is for education, right? It's not a thing that's addressed in the Constitution or the Declaration, but I think certainly could be put in that. And so it was a good kind of catch-all. So I always trick my students, though, because I say life, liberty, and then they all say pursuit of happiness, and I say property, because I'm talking about Locke, yeah. So it's fun. It's fun for me. That's what I'm saying. Thanks, Beth. Yes, published the same year, 1776, Wealth of Nations, right? I think, part of it was, the individuals that were kind of intending to run this thing, which were the individuals who were, putting up their sacred honor up there. And to me, the revolution was less of what we see under the French. They had a revolution a few years later. There was a revolution. They upended everything. They decided the days of the week aren't the same, the hours of the months of the year, the church they upended absolutely everything. So what's interesting when you talk about the American Revolution is they called it a revolution in the way that they saw the Glorious Revolution in Britain 100 years before, when John Locke was writing about. And the Glorious Revolution was when you changed from the Stuarts to the William and Mary, right? And so, it was more of a change of management. And so for the American Revolution, it was a little closer to that, right? I mean, think about it. I mean, yes, you see this monarchical thing, but they didn't make their total mind up until the Constitution that we weren't going to have a monarch, right? It wasn't a real popular idea, but the fact is it was still out there. And indeed, think about it. The states all kept their names. Georgia's name still there. It's named after King George. Carolinas, that's Charles. Maryland's Mary, right? Virginia, that's Queen Elizabeth. So, and they kept the borders, right? They kept the borders, they kept the names, they kept the English common law. Like there's a lot of things that sort of kept. So on the economic front, a lot of them were merchants and things like that. And so, John Hancock, who was the presided over the convention, was the richest person in New England. Why? He was a shipping person. And so I think that Adam Smith was part of that kind of Enlightenment sort of thing, and just the description of capitalism, and of course it was around before Wealth of Nations too, that it kind of fit in that, and the British were already kind of going that way anyway. And so they didn't quite upend, like I said, when I think of like revolution, like economic revolution, it wasn't there. I think it was just sort of part and parcel. That's sort of my take on it. It was like, it was sort of happening anyway, and I think it kept it there. They just needed to, collect taxes at their state level and not in London, right? That was the big problem. It's not that there can't be taxes. You just had to have representation, right? Does that help? Okay.
Can you speak a little bit to, you showed that great pamphlet, and there were other pamphlets during the Enlightenment period that we know of. Can you speak a little bit to some other very political pamphlets that, kind of precursors?
Do you have any in mind?
It's something that, I think of like the satirical ones, like a modern proposal or a modest proposal.
Like Jonathan Swift?
Yeah, Jonathan Swift.
I mean, there were some pamphlets that were put out sort of as funny things. So what you see is like Poor Richard's Almanac, which was Ben Franklin's publication before the Revolution, would have these like, real things and anecdotes and jokes and sort of like old-timey kinds of things that they added in there. And that was influential, I think, culturally. Jonathan Swift, like serving up and eating the babies is the modest proposal. Like, I don't think that was. I think that was more, like you said, massive satire. Now, some of the founders had written things before, and so the Notes in the States of the State of Virginia by Jefferson. I got some other Jefferson stuff here. He talked about some of these things, and the role of you could really divine like where are they from. That's how they knew he was an academic. They had already been published. John Adams, some revolutionary things. Like I said, some of the people like George Mason doing the Declaration of in Virginia. So you had some of this that really went there. I don't know of any particular one. I mean, common sense just took off. I think it probably shocked Thomas Paine more than anything else. Ironically, he wasn't done. So Thomas Paine, even though he was recently from England, he came, kind of helped foment the revolution here in the United States. And then he went to France and helped them with theirs too. So actually, one of the things he published while he was there is what he got tried for in England. And I hear from people that I guess the road where he lived, they renamed it Trader Lane and stuff like that. And so and he ended up writing a lot of other philosophical things on top of it. I mean, he kind of came from nowhere. He wasn't like a highly educated person, all that, but he ended up writing a lot of sort of things about the age of reason and stuff like that. So it was interesting to me to see kind of how you could lead to more things. Yeah, the other fun character is Marquis de Lafayette, who was a French general, and he was like 19. He was a general, and he came over to help with the revolution. Was on Washington's staff, and then he also went back and was part of the initial part of the French Revolution until they locked him up because Marquis. So I don't know of any others that really had that kind of oomph. And like I said, what was so amazing to that was, sure, you can go back and have, John Locke sitting on a shelf for 100 years, but you could have something from the year 1776 that influenced something that probably got put out there 6 months later. That to me, that's impressive. And it's sort of like, that's to me, that cultural thing from the bottom up, right? The plain language, right? And that's why you hear politicians, they got the plain language. They go, common man, all that, yeah.
Anybody else?
Anybody? I mean, it's lasting. It works. It's sort of, like I said, it was such an ideal that, like, it's really easy to look at it and be like, okay, all men are created equal. It's like, really? Like, you know who you guys are, right? You're like the richest, you're doing all these things. Is this really equal? And it's like, did you really mean that? But I think it was almost like writing higher than it had to be that, hey, we're going for broke here, if we could have it that way. Now, the other part of it is the fact that the American Revolution was a civil war, right? Not everybody was on board, and it was very destructive. And, you had, the people tried to like break down, like, well, how many were patriots? How many were loyalists, right? Loyalists wanted to stay with the British. They didn't see that it was that big of a deal. But eventually, then you just pretty much had them fighting each other, and these were neighbors. Like Philadelphia, they wrote the Declaration of Independence there, and Congress is meeting there, and that was all well and good until the British came up the river and took Philadelphia. And so, while the patriots were holding it, it was not very comfortable to be a loyalist. And a lot of them would leave or sell their things or maybe just suffer through. But then the British took over, and it wasn't really good to be a patriot in town. And then eventually the patriots came back and took it back over, right? And so you had this sort of thing happen, and you had quite a few American colonists that left and never came back, even to the point of Benjamin Franklin. So Benjamin Franklin, the big time influence on being the most famous American, all this, and was very outspoken, lobbied on behalf of America. Served in both for the Declaration and the Constitution. His own son was the colonial governor of New Jersey, and was captured and was ransomed and went to England as the war was finishing and never spoke to his father ever again. I mean, they talk about, you think about the Civil War and breaking of families, like, yeah, that's what was happening with this one. You had some loyalists went to Canada, and some loyalists went to Canada and actually came down with the British to fight their old brethren and saw them in the battlefield, and and some like crazy things like stabbed each other and like just the stuff you wouldn't think was real, but it was that sort of brutal. So yes, the ideas were really big, and you had all of this, but like I said, you had a lot of groups that still felt left out over American history to sort of like live up to those ideals. Because they got them all to sign. So even those that like in the South, like you said, they got representatives, and those signatures are from all 13 states. And so, yes, they had all that, but the fact is, once there was fighting, there was no more, they weren't going to negotiate anything. Even if they had friends in Parliament, they weren't going to go for it. But that doesn't mean that there weren't more loyalist strongholds, and I think the British, as they were fighting, assumed there was a lot more British loyalists than there were. And kept trying to find them, and then it's interesting, when they wouldn't. And so you had interesting things where like New York was held by the British for the majority of the war, and so that's where you had Nathan Hale getting captured and all these things. And so the loyalists did stick around there. They say Staten Island always was loyalist, and so. And so they were able to kind of stay there because there was enough. Now, it just comes down to the British can send ships full of people, and they can get mercenaries from Germany, which they did. They can do all these things, but the fact is, there's still a lot more colonists than there are them. And I think it's just the numbers game that really kind of gets there. That's why, so some of the places like in South Carolina was an insurgency, right? Because the British very easily captured Savannah and Charleston and all these places, but when you got inland, they weren't so loyalist anymore, and they kept kind of fighting, and so there's lots of little battles out there. It wasn't just Boston and Yorktown. There was a lot kind of going on. So people tried to do the math, like maybe there was like a third of the population were patriot, a third were loyalists, and the other third were just going to see what was going to happen. Maybe that's true. Honestly, I don't know that you could ever get really great numbers for that. But certainly it wasn't all the same, right? And some people, once they witnessed things or they had their neighbors going to fight, that was a pretty good convincing thing. Like, oh, I should join the patriot cause because that's what the people around here are doing.
I'll ask you a final easy question. What's the name of that new class you're teaching in the fall?
Oh yeah. Yeah, so we're starting a new class. It's an American Studies class. It's AMS 2010. It's called Civic Discourse, American... Yeah, Civic Discourse in the American Political Order. So if you're interested, Dr. Misha Rudden and I will be teaching that starting in the fall. So that should be, this kind of stuff is what we get to do.
All right, so we're going to wrap it up.
Yeah.
But before we do, can I get a round of applause for Professor Norton?
Thank you.